ahead and start recording, and I'll see if I can figure out how to advance this. Is this going to work? Ah, it is.
Okay,
Yeah.
go.
Oh, great. Okay, so welcome to the Taming Your Data Dragon, How to Cure Your Data Addictions and Get the Insights You Need edition of this month's Katie Paine's Measurement Hour, and we welcome everybody. And as Philip and I were just talking, data is a very timely topic these days. And I probably should have put slides in here about the upcoming GDPR stuff going on in Europe about data privacy, but that's going to have to wait for another episode. So here's what kind of happened over the last few years is that there were myths about data, right? A lot of them were promulgated by people in the data world, right? People who were mining this data and getting all this data. And all of a sudden, the more data you had, the better it was. And if you look at some of the platforms and service providers and measurement providers like Simply Measured, who I love, or Sprinkler, or any of these guys, they just have a ton of data. And when you start, and the same thing with Google Analytics, and in the beginning that was wonderful, but now we're all drowning in it, right? So the other big myth is that all data is good data, and in reality most data is bad data. I've been involved in a couple of audits of data lately, and it's awful, right? I mean, there's so many both false, I meant to put that slide in here, but anyway, you have to read our newsletter to see the image I was talking about. There's so many false positives and false negatives and just stuff that doesn't even belong in there. Too often it's, references that, aren't necessarily relevant, especially in these days where, news may be first reported on Twitter and then goes to the national news and then flies around the world in social. It gets abbreviated, it gets changed. We know some large percentage of it is fake to begin with, but then it gets made more fake or amplified in a way to make it more fake. So you really have to, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but you really have to make sure that what you're using to make decisions and report on and all the rest of that stuff is good data, because not much of it really is. And data does not mean results. Just because you have data, just even because you have numbers, does not mean you're necessarily reporting results. So where do we get here, right? So Avinash Kaushik, who is my total hero out there, because he started writing about and managing the data universe from within Google Analytics years ago. And actually within Intuit is where I met him, I think, first. But anyway, he was a data geek way back when. And he wrote this wonderful blog post that basically says, you're the thrall to the data puking dragon. And that's such an apt image, because it really is. It's the avalanche of data today is puking a lot of garbage up there and threatening to overwhelm us. And thanks to the internet, I found this wonderful image of a data puking dragon. So the first part was, we all had data for years, right? There was always media monitoring or media measurement data. We were looking at 20, 30,000 records of, Lockheed and stuff like that a decade ago. But all of a sudden it became a whole lot easier to get a whole lot more data. And what's interesting is the stuff that I used to call a lot of data, when I had a year's worth of, media numbers or web analytics or whatever it was a decade ago, I'd have, a whole bunch of data for a client. That's now considered small data, because the big data that people are really talking about are these thousands and thousands and millions of records of, what Cambridge Analytica and Facebook were up to influence elections isn't that different from the kind of data mining that's going on. I mean, years ago, the hotel industry, the government, in a lot of ways, are all, have all been using large data sets to, find fraud or, find trends or whatever. All that stuff's been going on. Now our stuff is called small data, but there's still an awful lot of it. And that led to this, the more data, the better. Today's digital publishing model has been getting an awful lot of attention these days because of the Cambridge Analytica Facebook mess. But in reality, as people are increasingly saying, is that because we get everything on Facebook and Twitter and everything else for free, we are essentially the product, and we should, we all sort of, those of us who are smart about this stuff, understand that, our actions and likes and engagement and all the stuff that we do is constantly being mined and sold. Now, the problem with that, and that has been the model even back when we were reading newspapers, and we contributed to the circulation figure, and therefore we contributed to ad dollars. Well, it's not going to work, and it's not going to work terribly well forever, because A, people don't like to have their privacy infringed upon. This whole thing about fake news and the Cambridge Analytica stuff is making people, run away from Facebook, change their settings. So the same level of data isn't going to be available, but we sort of got here because, oh, goody, these people are liking and doing all this stuff on Facebook and talking about stuff. And so now I can identify, a paranoid, scared, single mom in the woods of Finland or Idaho or wherever, and I can target that person and make her more paranoid, so therefore she will be more likely to vote for this candidate. And the Russians were doing that back in 2010. Obviously, they're still doing it. We've probably done it. Lots of people are doing it. And that whole concept of collecting data, and then that's the product that you're selling to your advertisers, that's how we got here. Last for longer, much longer. But then social became as powerful and as big as it is because it had all these analytics. And web and digital advertising got to be where it is because it had all these analytics. So that's the background, right? Then you add on top of that, this, in the post-recession era, the demand for accountability and metrics and dashboards. And now all of a sudden you've got to, it's not just that you've got the data, now you have to present it, now you have to use it, now you have to show it in some way, shape, or form. And that's where we got around to an awful lot of data puking, and I'll get into that in just a second. So the construct of how you manage data today is if you remember nothing about today other than this is what you got to remember, is that when you are faced with tons of data, and literally one of the crazy calls I was on yesterday was, this particular organization wants to analyze and code and qualify both their internal and their external communications. So the question is, oh my God, we get a lot of discussion out there on internal discussion on Yammer, and we put a lot of the stuff out there. So what do we measure? And I said, it kind of depends upon what your goals are. We've already defined those goals. They're these 4 things. You use the data that, will help you get to those 4 things. And there were people in the room who were very upset because their data didn't fall into that category. But the point is you can't just use all the data out there. You've got to figure out what really matters and what data you need to measure progress against what matters, right? What matters are the goals, the objectives, the strategic priorities, whatever you want to call them, the ambitions, I've heard every name in the book. Whatever you want to call them, your company or your organization has them. And your goal as a communicator is to make progress as best you can with the communications tools and the budget you have. You're supposed to make progress, towards those goals. And what you need to decide is, what data do I need to measure that progress? Now, here's my example is, again, client of mine have a ton of data, right? They have 97,000 metrics that are coming out of Google Analytics and out of Sprinkler and out of you name it. And they have 4 strategic priorities. So first of all, their goals are, the reason corporate communications exists is to, basically protect the image, i.e. maintain the stock price. B, recruit talent and retain talent. And in order to do that, they are charged with communicating certain positions, certain messages. And this goes for internal and external. And so I said, the question is, you've got 900 different metrics here from all these things. Let's focus on the ones, how do you know that you're making progress towards these 4 priorities? And let's just say, I'm making this up, but let's just say that the 4 of them are, more people know us as a good, sustainable company. More people know us as a great place to work, or think of us as a great place to work. And more people think of us as innovative, right? So those are your priorities, your communications messages. All of those have to do with people's perceptions, which means that you're going to have to do a survey, right? You have to do regular surveys. You're going to have to measure people's changing perceptions about you, whether they think of you as a good place to work, whether they think of you as a good, sustainable company, whatever those things are, you're going to have to do surveys. Because all of that data out of your web analytics, out of everything else, is not going to tell you whether you're moving towards those goals. So you've got to define what really matters and what data you need to know, hey, I am making progress towards making sure that everybody knows us as a great, sustainable company. And once you've done that, it's, it's a fairly simple process. You collect it, you do surveys, right? I mean, you can decide that your goal is to get more leads, in which case it might be Google conversions, but whatever it is, whatever the goal is, whatever the metric's going to be, you go out there and collect it. And chances are pretty good you might have to do some new research in order to collect it, but that's the process. But you're not done yet, because just collecting it and reporting numbers is not the goal. Then you have to make sure it's the right data, right? And that means having data that you can do crosstabs on, that you can dig down into, because it's not enough to say, hey, the perception of us as a sustainable company is 30%, right? That tells you nothing, because you don't know whether it was 15% before or 35% before. So you have to hold on to it and have something to compare it to. And you have to make sure that in all of that stuff, your questions are valid, your dates are valid, that all of these things are valid, and that you're getting the right answers. And then you want to be able, again, as I said, to cross-tab it so you can perhaps figure out what's working and what's not working. So if you're doing internal communications, you want to make sure you cross-tab it by division or department or something, so that if your range of agreement with, I understand the corporate strategies is 20% to 80%, you want to know who's at the 20% level, and you want to know why. So you have to have the crosstabs as well as, and those have to be valid. So that's one of the reasons why I say, you really do need to, try to get 300-400 surveys back so that you have enough data to crosstab. Then the big aha here is analyze it and find some insights and report results. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the tricks of doing that. But the point is not just to collect data. It's really to get the insights and then do a report that's going to persuade people to do what you think needs to be done. So how to tame this data puking dragon. Spend some time Googling taming dragons. It's very cute on Google. So the first way you tame your data puking dragon is collect only the data you need, which means if you're looking at media, what media matters to your target stakeholders, right? What influences your target stakeholders? If you're working on internal stuff, what channels can you control? What messages can you control? All right. I mean, you don't want to necessarily collect data on safety announcements or emergency management announcements that the government says that you have to put out there. What you want to do is figure out what matters to your stakeholders, what's going to convince them to change their behavior or their opinions of you. So don't collect everything, right? Do not collect every newspaper article about you, in the world or the United States even, because an awful lot of those media outlets aren't going to matter. I mean, you were here last month, the truth is the fact that an awful lot of media outlets are not believed or trusted by about half the country. So if your target is that half of the country, these media outlets are not the places to be. So you got to figure out what matters to your stakeholders and then what data is going to help you achieve your strategic priorities. And that means being very selective about the data you collect and what it's supposed to tell you. And, the average likes, clicks, and engagements are great if they help you achieve your strategic priorities. But if you can't draw even a dotted line between likes and clicks and shares and comments and all the rest of that stuff and your strategic priorities, then don't report on them. I'm not saying don't collect them. They might be useful in some other way, but in terms of really sort of shaping your decision making, the numbers and the data you want are the ones that are going to help you move towards those strategic priorities. The other piece is, just because there is fresh data there every single day or every single week does not necessarily mean you have to report on it. And this is a big mistake I see that a lot of people make, which is, let's do a weekly report on everything that's happening on our intranet or our social sites or whatever. The question is, are you going to make decisions? Are you going to change direction? Are you going to make big decisions on a weekly basis? If so, absolutely, then report on a weekly basis. But if not, then you don't need to report on it. I mean, I just had a major client basically drop a lot of their quarterly reports because it's the end of the year. They've already set in place the strategy for next year. And frankly, nothing's going to change in that fourth quarter report. I mean, they're going to do an end of the year report. They're going to do a half year report. But in that interim quarter between now and the end of the fiscal year, nobody's going to make a different decision. They're still going to be going in the same direction. So when leadership says, hey, this is the direction we're going in, nobody's going to change us, you don't need to report it if you're not going to change anybody's minds or anybody's behaviors. So only report as often as you make decisions, no more, no less. And then by all means, take all this data, whatever it is that you are doing, and create standard terminologies and definitions. Now, I've spent the better part of a month doing this for one of my clients. And let me just give you a couple of examples. If you're collecting data from different vendors, right? I have multiple vendors that I'm dealing with. My job was to get them to agree on some terminology. So you have an article ID, an item ID, a record ID, and a content ID. And so when all those things try to come in and you're trying to figure out what's what, it's a waste of your time. And you're paying these guys. It's like, no, we're going to call this an item ID, and that's what it's going to be called. And I don't care what your system makes me do. You are going to report out this as an item ID. Similar problem with, is it an outlet? Is it a publication? Is it, whatever you call it? Is it an influencer? Is it an author? Is it favorable? Is it sentiment? Is it tone? What are some of the other examples in here? Oh, just stupid stuff about, language spellings and stuff like that. Make sure everybody that you are collecting data from is spelling things the same way and using the same terminology. That will help you speed through your reporting process, I promise you. And it's for things like engagement, right? Make sure everybody's defining engagement the same way. Make sure that everybody's defining impressions the same way if they're, God help you, using them. But making sure that there's standard methodologies and standard definitions is absolutely critical. Otherwise, you're going to waste a ton of time. Trust me, I've wasted that time. And especially if you're using outside vendors, but even if it's your own stuff, just go through there and audit it at least once a month. Make sure that some algorithm hasn't screwed up. Make sure that something hasn't happened, that their search terms are correct, whatever it is. Just audit your data regularly, because you do not want to be there 48 hours before your report is due and suddenly realize that your entire database is screwed up. Been there. Been there, done that, and it's an awful, awful, awful experience. So do not wait until the night before you're trying to put a report together to audit your data. So how do you get the volume of data down to a manageable level? Forget the tree, focus on the forest. Everybody wants to measure their own little tree, right? I want to measure Yammer. I want to measure my work on Twitter. I want to measure my work on Facebook. I want to measure, this blog. I want to measure that blog. Fine, but do it on your own time. Because what measurement really should be about is the forest. Are you influencing your stakeholders, and are you making progress towards the ambitions and the goals that you're supposed to be achieving, right? So number one is forget the trees, focus on the forest. Number two is make sure you are focusing on, especially in the media world, on the individuals and outlets that actually influence your stakeholders. Just said that before about, what people believe, but you really do not need to monitor and measure the universe of publications. You need to monitor and measure the universe of influences on your stakeholders. And whatever you do, be careful of comparing apples and goats. This is the problem with unparalleled terminology. Google Analytics reports activity every single day. Whether there's activity or not, it doesn't matter. They report out every single day. Cision does not. Cision gives you a report of when you have coverage, or whoever you use. So the first thing you got to make sure is that if you are trying to compare the level of web traffic you've generated from a certain PR effort, make sure that you are comparing if you're doing correlations, you have to compare day to day, not, month to month, and the months don't even match up. Make sure that you are not trying to compare two things that are essentially different, percentages versus numbers. Difference in the movement in terms of point level or percentage point levels versus raw impressions. They're just really, really careful that you're only comparing those goats and goats and apples and apples. I recommend no more than 5 overarching metrics for a communications department. If you want to have individual, so that's all of corporate communications. Under that, 3 to 5 for PR, 3 to 5 for internal, 3 to 5 for social, whatever you want, but that's about it. Anything more than that, everybody's eyes are going to glaze over, and you know you're going to lose your audience. The other thing is, I'm going to actually do a quick video on this sometime very soon. But if you don't know how to use, and Philip, maybe you can instruct your students on this. But anyway, basically, there's a function in Excel that eliminates duplicates. You just have to have a unique identifier. So when I was talking before about an article ID or a content ID or record ID, typically, when data comes in from wherever you get it, it has a unique record ID. And so the first thing I do when I get a spreadsheet from somebody is I go to remove data. It's under the data tab. Remove duplicates, and I remove everything that's got the same data ID. Because that'll get rid of all the duplicates. You can get fancier and look and compare date and pub and title, and if you don't have an article ID, you can look at the date of the publication, the title, name of the publication, and if all those three things match, chances are it's a duplicate. So simple ways of just reducing the volume of data. Now then the question becomes, fine, I've got clean, valid data. Now how do I get some insight from it? And I love, love, love this chart. Again, this came from Avinash Kaushik's blog, and it was done by somebody, and I didn't put her name in here, but if you want to know, I'll add it in. Anyway, this is like the perfect graphic, right? This is all you really need to tell people, right? Put everything in your all the data, right, for all the campaigns, all the efforts you do in a quarter, say, and you know, rank it low value or high value, low cost to high cost, you know, and then look at the stuff in the upper left hand corner and don't do any more of it because that's high cost, low value, and look at the right hand corner and say, okay, let's do more of that. And then look at the other two and say, okay, can we add a little bit more money to this and get it to be more effective, or can we just drop it? But this is essentially the best chart in the world because this is the things that everybody wants to see. So basically, as you go to report from your data, right, the first question you have to ask yourself is, what decisions do you need to make, right? Or does your boss or your leadership team need to make? And what data do you need to make them, right? So you're really going back to your communications roots and saying, I have a story to tell, right? I don't have enough people, or I don't have enough spokespeople, or I don't have enough resources, or I have too many resources, or I have too much of this, or I have too much of that. Anyway, whatever the story is, then not to say that you are biasing your data, but if your data says, look I got an awful lot of stuff in that upper left-hand corner that is low value, high cost, and I need to do less of it, I'm going to take a chart like that, put the names of those campaigns or those products or whatever it happens to be into those 4 quadrants, take it to my boss and say, look, I do 57,000 things. 75% of them are in this upper left-hand corner. I need help figuring out how to say no to people because these things aren't working and I'm overworked, right? That's the story you're telling with this chart, okay? As you are thinking about your report, whether it's going to be presented in person or delivered on or read on an airplane, right? You need, just as you would for anything else, you need to remember what's keeping your boss up at night, right? What's keeping leadership up at night? What are they worrying about? Because what they want is they want solutions. They want to know how they can fix stuff. They know, help me solve this problem. And if you go in there with a whole bunch of data that says, I know your problem, and here's the data to back it up, and this is what we need to fix it, you're golden. You are absolutely golden. But if you go in there and say, we had a big spike in June. This is what happened last month. This is what happened the month before. This is the trend line. A, everybody's going to go to sleep. B, it's not solving any problems for your boss, and they're not going to pay any attention to it. So you need to define the story you want to tell. And I want to say one more thing about this, which is choose your numbers and make sure they matter. I recently had an example of a very, very detailed report that I did. And it was based on a model that we had used in the past. And it focused on the gap between what leaders say relative to the priorities of the company versus what leaders actually do. Mm-hmm. And the message is always, basically, if there's a gigantic gap between what leaders say and leaders do, you have a credibility problem, right? People don't believe people if they just talk about stuff and they don't do anything about it. And so I had done all of these charts that showed, here's the percent that show that they've heard the leaders say this stuff, and here are the charts that leaders did stuff, you know, and I rank ordered them by the length of the gap and the size of the gap and blah, 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 way too many charts. And a lot of that was driven by the request of the client. And what I heard back was the CEO threw the report out and said, there's nothing in here that I didn't already know. Biggest waste of money ever. So upon hearing that, I choked and did a little data puking of my own, and then realized that the message really was that less than 50% of the entire employee base was seeing their leaders do something in support of the strategic priorities. One data point. That's all they needed, right? And I had done a 73-page report and analyzed everything from here to Sunday. Because I had been told, oh, the CEO really likes data and the CEO really likes this and whatever. No, he needed to hear that an awful lot of his senior leadership team was not doing anything to support the priorities. So glazed eyeballs, right, are a typical problem when you're reporting data, right? Oh God, you know, here's all these slides and, you know, I'm supposed to pay attention to them and everybody's got glazed eyeballs, right? Stop reporting. Literally stop reporting. Don't even start with methodology or, you know, here's where we were last month. You've got everybody's attention. You've got about 27 seconds to grab their attention. Grab it with something that says, hey, less than half your employees are hearing anything about the priorities from their senior leadership. Or 30% of the, another one where 30%, 20% of the people that you are targeting in terms of key reporters have retired. You really need to update your media list. You know, and the data didn't say that they'd retired. The data said they'd stopped covering them. I started looking into why they'd stopped covering them, and the reality was they'd retired and moved on to other beats. That was the story, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with this. It is now my favorite expression, which is what's in it for me, add more WIFM. I have a client that literally WIFM is part of their quality score. WIFM is part of the way they rate their employee communications, their external communication, all of the stuff. And I think it is a great thing to remember, which is if you are reporting to senior leadership, there's got to be something in it for them. They need to understand either this is what I'm doing right, or this is what's going on that's wrong that I need to fix. But for them, it's what can I fix and how can I make stuff better? A lot of people panic when they have to make these reports. Trust me, I'm on the other end of those phone calls. There's two types of people, right? Two types of answers here. One is audit your data, understand what's in it, right? Make sure it's valid. Don't get up there and say 47 trillion people had the opportunity to see my stuff because there are not 47 trillion people on the planet. I don't care what Meltwater tells you. I don't care what your report says. Be sensible about this stuff, right? There are 6 billion people on, 6+ billion people on the planet. Half of them don't have computers, electricity, or the ability to read whatever the hell it is that, you know, mentions you. And a lot of them don't care. And I don't care whether the general public is your audience, they still don't care. So make sure that your data reflects your stakeholders and what's important. And there will always be skeptics, right? You know that there will always be skeptics in the room. There's either skeptics because they hate PR or they hate communications or they're data geeks or whatever. Then know that, right? Understand who's going to be in the room. Be prepared for it. Don't get rattled by it. And answer data with data. You know, be comfortable around your data. My favorite story, and poor Philip has probably heard this a dozen times by now, but was my client who got my report an hour before she had to go into a room at a meeting. She had no idea what it was all about. I mean, she had put it together and whatever, but she really hadn't had time to digest it. But she was getting attacked by a skeptic who basically said, I don't think our PR is nearly as good as it was when Ralph was doing it. And of course, this was a new person, female, younger, with progressive ideas. And, you know, fortunately, she'd read just enough of my report to say, well, in fact, our coverage is it's up by about 20%, and it's 27% more positive than it was last year, and it contains 52% more messages. Do you have any other questions? Right? So answer data and skeptics with data. And too many numbers, too little times. This goes back to put your data on a diet, right? Know what your key message is. When you go out to the media, you know what your key messages are, right? You know those things. Well, you need to develop your own key messages for your reporting because it's exactly the same problem. You can't tell everybody everything. You need to know what that one or maybe two messages are that you're going to communicate, and then only use the charts that illustrate it. Don't put any other data in there that doesn't illustrate your story or your key message. And make sure when you end, right, there's a call to action. What do you want people to do? I want you to give me more money. I want you to give me more people. I want you to get out there and help me communicate this message. I want you to beat this guy up over here who's not cooperating. Whatever it happens to be, you know your message and you have a call to action at the end. Never just say that's the end of the presentation. Your conclusion is we need to do this. And, you know, presumably the data you've had will convince them to say yes, right? But make sure that the data is in there to convince them. So this, I'm not going to go through all of these. You're welcome to question me on them later on, but this is just a list of, I've been asked this so many times, what are the most essential metrics for every form of communications? And these are just a few that I throw out there for events, things like, you know, cost per minute spent with your prospect at a trade show, pre-post percent increase, share of desirable voice, conversions, number one, you know, perhaps incoming queries, leads, whatever, preference consideration, earned media. I got a few more because there's a lot more there, but, you know, use a media quality index to make sure that you're getting quality coverage out there. Conversions again, coverage containing more messages, share of voice, decrease in desirable share of voice versus undesirable share of voice, preference, consideration, awareness, and internal, it might be willingness to recommend, increase engagement, and or understanding of company priorities. But if you look at all of that, right, okay, so I violated my own rule on the earned media piece because there's more than 5. But 3 to 5 are all you need. Dump all the rest. That's my final message. Collect only the data you need to measure the success against your goals, right? Trust no data until you validate it. And please do this, if nothing else. I know everybody gets wrapped up in collecting data, but allocate and spend twice as much effort analyzing your data as you do collecting it, because it's only in the analysis that you're really going to get use out of your data. And whatever you do, do not report. Tell the story that needs to be told. Reporting is boring. Stories are interesting. And with that, we have time for some questions. Do we have any questions? Unmute yourself if you have them.
Katie, I put a question and you were talking about reporting only as often as you make decisions. But is that like reporting to C-suite? Because you want to monitor, so you want to keep getting your data and looking at it.
Monitoring and reporting are two very different things.
Okay.
Right? Stop sharing. There we go. Of course, now I can't find my GoToMeeting thing. Yeah, monitoring and reporting are two very different things. Monitoring is necessary, obviously, in this era of crises to make sure that, you know, what's going on out there. But reporting is very different. Reporting is basically saying, I mean, if you are in crisis mode or if you are a highly visible company, you can certainly take your monitoring reports and summarize it once a week. But what happens so often is that people get into the habit of doing that, and then nobody pays any attention. It just, everybody gets the glazed eyeball effect. And people say, oh, well, you need to measure this and you need to measure this. And the next thing you know, you've got 150 stories summarized in a 20-page email every morning that people are trying to read on their phone on the bus. Ain't gonna happen, right? It's just not realistic. And so I think you need to step backwards and think about the forest on a regular basis, because what I've seen over the years is, you know, the 5-page monthly report or the 5-page quarterly report ends up being a 73-page monthly report way too quickly. Or the, you know, 5-bullet-point daily monitoring report ends up being a 25-page monitoring report very quickly. So I think you really need to kind of take that big step backwards and look to, you know, and here's the other thing, nobody does this, and I so wish they would, which is interview the people that you're sending this stuff to. Like, just send them out a little, you know, quick freebie survey, and say, hey, you get these things all the time. Do you use them? What parts do you like? What parts do you not like? Are they too long? Are they too short? You know, what do you like? Because I think that's a huge piece that people forget, is that you got an audience out there. You need to know whether they like what it is that you're reporting on.
Yeah, that reminds me of the ICA tried to make a organizational communication audit some years ago to talk about, am I getting too much, too little, on time, too late, too early? Yeah, so to audit that kind of stuff too is important.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a piece of that that also has to be asked, which is, especially at the ICA, but in so often, there's like one set of questions, which is, do you like it? And there's another set of questions, which is, what do you do with the data that I've given you? And this goes into sort of measuring impact. Why are you sending this stuff out? Well, you're sending it out so people have knowledge of what's going on in the world, or what the competition is doing, or how we're doing out there relative to other things. But it's almost like you have to test their knowledge from time to time, not just whether they like it. I'm doing a wonderfully interesting, fascinating project to measure the effectiveness of public awareness campaigns around safety issues. And it's sparked a lot of really interesting conversations about, is awareness enough? You know, it's definitely not enough that they like the communications or they think it's frequent enough. The question is, are they actually aware of the communications? And B, is their knowledge and behavior resulting as a result of the communication? Don't have an answer to that one yet. Give me 3 weeks until until the results come back in. And then I'll analyze the data and share my insights.
No, I think that's what I've appreciated about spending time in your material and talking with you is that, just getting to those core, deep, clear questions that shape things. So, and
it's tough. It's
yeah.
tough. It's really tough to get people to answer those questions. This is why, I mean, as soon as this project is done and launched and they're happy, I'm going to beg them to let me use them as a case study, or at least name the measurement maven, because I've rarely seen an organization put their data on a huge diet from a lot of data that nobody was really using to literally, 5 core metrics for each division and 5 core metrics overall. I mean, division being external or internal, et cetera. And then 5 or 6 core metrics overall. And I always expect people to get distracted and, stop paying attention. And, boy, they are on track to shed tons and tons of data points. And they're asking those questions, why are we reporting this? It's not, we don't know whether this means that. Does this mean awareness? Does this mean understanding? Like, well, how about we devise a way to check to see if increased engagement on Yammer translates into greater understanding? And the way you do that is you say, okay, let's talk to the people who are engaged on Yammer, interview them, and see whether they understand the corporate goals.
Yeah, right. Of course, the cynical answer is that when I throw a lot of numbers at people, they think I'm doing a good job.
Yeah. And I think that was very, very true 5 years ago, when there were so few numbers out there and where nobody in communications was really using numbers and saying, oh, just trust me, it works. I think that was very true. I get the sense from the extremely elite self-selected examples that I talk to, I get the feeling that's not working. I mean, literally almost every client I've had within the last year and a half has come to me because their boss has said, I don't understand these. What do these numbers mean? What do these metrics mean? These don't reflect our goals and objectives. We really need to measure better. We need to measure what matters. We need to measure impact, all of these things. And they come to me to say that because it's like, yeah, but they need the outside, metric shrink, the measurement shrink, because I think that a lot of it is so ingrained internally that we need all this data. And it's like, yeah, no, you really don't. You really just need to look at this stuff. And this is where it's really hard, because some people have been measuring and getting bonuses and getting rewarded for certain data points and increasing engagement or increasing whatever the heck it is. And all of a sudden you're taking that away and, oh, now what? So it's a challenging situation to go from a lot of data down to a little bit of data, and has to be done very gently.
Yeah, right. From a Grunig perspective, right, the ideal is that you have a great relationship. You sit at the right tables and everybody trusts each other, and you bringing them really valuable boundary information.
Yeah, but that may be true of one person. Yeah. First of all, I find that the pieces on the chessboard move too rapidly to rely on that theory for terribly long. You know, the speed with which CMOs move around and lose their job and get hired, and even CEOs or CCOs, it seems like there are some great long-term relationships like that. But even there, I mean, even frankly, there's some of the ones that are coming to me saying, I need to do a better job of measurement. I have this great relationship. Nobody's questioning what I'm doing, right? In case one of my cases, they just got a huge raise. But they want better metrics so that they can make better decisions and understand what they need to do better.
Great. That's great information. Look, I don't know if Diana is there. She might be able to unmute. I can't see.
I can try it. Diana, do you have any questions? If not. Yes, sir. Oh, nope.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Great. Good. Well, that's great. The next, you know what? I printed out my calendar, and because I was going to say, okay, our next measurement hour is going to be on the 25th of April, and we'll be using Zoom, and you'll get new information as to how to log in. Thank you again, Philip, for this.
Good, great.
And we'll see you again on the 25th of April. What did I say? That's right, Wednesday the 25th of April. We'll see you back here.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks so much.